Hi, thanks so much for joining me. My name is Reddy, and I teach at Lewis and Clark Law School. And before I begin this presentation, I'd just like to take a moment to thank Josh Smasser and the rest of the ALR staff for organizing this year's Animal Law Review Symposium and for securing another avenue for this talk to be presented in light of COVID-19, which also sadly features in the present day part of my talk. The title for which is Judging the Greatness of a Nation, the Politics of Meat, Milk, Murder, and Moral Progress in India. And I wanted to read it aloud in the hopes that it might resonate with some of you, as it's inspired by the quote often attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, and that is that the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. And as a human and animal rights advocate, I wanted to hold a mirror up to that argument in light of, on the one hand, the recognition among animal advocates that India stands at the forefront of animal rights progress. For example, the country ushered in some significant protections in the areas of animal transport, animal entertainment, and testing. It's the only country in the world that constitutionally mandates a compassion for animals from its citizens. And it's a country that has recognized animal personhood across multiple jurisdictions. But on the other hand, also because we're also seeing so much communal violence carried out in the name of certain animals in the country, specifically cows, by advocates who would refer to themselves as cow rakshaks or cow protection vigilantes. And they've drawn support from India's current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, who in 2014 ascended to power in part based on his campaign promise to stop cow slaughter across the state. And so what we've seen since his ascension are waves upon waves of state-based cow protection laws that have emboldened these cow rakshaks or cow protection vigilantes to assault particularly vulnerable minority groups, including Muslims, Christians, Dalits, who are sometimes still referred to in the West as untouchables. According to a Human Rights Watch report, between May 2015 and December of 2018, at least 44 people, 36 of them Muslim, were killed across 12 states, with almost 300 injured across 20 states. And the violence has continued to rise since Modi's re-election last year, and the spate of violence has called into question what animal protection means in this sort of our modern political landscape, where we're increasingly seeing animal protection groups forming political parties to speak on behalf of quote-unquote voiceless animals. And of course, although this talk focuses on the Indian context, my hope is that advocates around the world will find it useful in rethinking sort of the benefits as well as the pitfalls of politicizing animals who have no actual political valence, and so can be co-opted by folks who reside on the left as well as those who reside on the right, by religious groups and secular groups as well. So with that said, I'd like to sort of turn the page back, so to speak, and offer an overview of how we arrived at this crisis point in India. So I'm going to focus here a little bit less on the apotheosis of the cow, except to say that her sanctity was predicated on her sort of value to a largely agricultural economy. And so these religious narratives were created fashioning her as quote unquote this mother cow. And they were developed to provide for her protection as well as her inviolability. To put it quite simply, India was basically at the mercy and still is at the mercy of the unpredictable monsoon season. And so it was found that only those farmers who kept their cattle alive, whether for milk or for labor, only those farmers were able to recover in times of famine. And so slowly you see sort of these religious lawmakers sort of bring our cow, our mother cow, who's referred to here as Kamadhenu, the giver of plenty. And she slowly sort of integrated into some of these religious myths. Her milk is seen as sort of the nourishment for early men, and she's also, again, likened to this mother-like figure. So in respect to this, killing her was basically paramount to matricide. But this case for, advancing cow protection among the general population didn't really stick until the cow became sort of this banner of resistance against successive Mughal invaders in about the 7th century. And so we might have all of these sort of disparate Hindu tribes, but we have one mother cow. And the idea was that we would fight under her banner to protect sort of mother cow from these foreign invaders. More or less, however, this sort of Hindu faction lost. But the first thing that the Mughal emperors did, Babur, who was the first ruler to sort of conquer India, the first thing he did was ban cow slaughter, whether out of respect or simply to keep the peace. His descendants, however, were sort of less inclined to make that concession. You know, after a while, they were sort of this monotheistic faith and weren't necessarily going to be tolerant of this apotheosized cow. And so the Mughal reign was ultimately brought down by the British East India Company as a colonial satellite. What the British did was they created this sort of army of Indians, which was comprised of both Hindus and Muslims. And then in 1857, we have what's called the First Great War of Indian Independence, which is also known as the Greased Cartridge Affair. Um, and just to give you a little bit of background here and why this is so important is that you had all these grease cartridges that were created and manufactured in Britain, and they had to sort of survive the journey from England to India. So the wet conditions and the salty conditions of the sea, as well as during monsoon season. And so what sort of the manufacturers did was that they greased these cartridges, as you can see in the slide here, with grease. But the question was, well, what was that grease really made of? And you had these rumors going around amongst sort of these Indian soldiers that it was either greased with beef fat or pork lard or both. And that sort of incited a rebellion. And it was really sort of this powder keg. And I wanted to share with you just some of the images depicting the war. And given sort of the paramount role that animals play in sort of this uprising, I think it's significant that the British sort of conceptualized their victory, their ultimate victory, as sort of this British lion taking down the Bengal tiger. So we see animals sort of brought in as political symbols, not just from Indians who were fighting for their independence, but also from the British themselves. And so even though the British ultimately put down this rebellion, it taught them this valuable lesson, and that's just how formidable a united front of Hindus and Muslims against them could be. And so they crafted what's called a divide and rule approach, whereby they basically enfranchised all Indians, but did so along communal lines, creating sort of these separate electorates for Muslims and for Hindus. And more than that, they really took stock of the grease cartridge affair, and basically they weaponized it. And they did so by encouraging both beef consumption on the one hand and cow protection on the other. And, you know, the strategy worked quite well, perhaps too well, in fact. You see communal tensions boiling over into riots in the 1880s when the first cow protection group was formed. Thousands of people died, mostly Muslims. And you also saw the creation of these very first cow protection groups, these cow rakshaks, as I mentioned earlier. And they're patrolling roads, they're seizing cows, bulls, and bullocks from butchers, and they're delivering them over to these sort of cow shelters. And again, it was sort of returning to this cow being this sort of this banner of faith and resistance to all outside interveners. Some animal advocates, as you can see here on the slide, they turned to the law, and this was, 1888, and basically what you had was the very first animal law case brought in India, if not the entire British Empire. There was this law under the Penal Code which made it offense to destroy, quote, an object that was held sacred to any class of persons, with the knowledge, basically, that would be regarded as an insult to that group or class. And cow protection advocates, mostly Hindus, argued that the cow, as one of these sacred objects, should be protected from harm. But the High Court rejected these Hindu petitioners' argument that the cow was, quote, an object within the meaning of the act. And, to put it simply, violence ensued, and cow protection again became a pretext for both anti-British and anti-Muslim violence. And it was around this time that you saw a lot of sort of propaganda being created. And this is a pretty interesting example. You have, again, that Kamadhenu image that I showed you earlier. You have it basically represented here with, this Hindu gentleman trying to stop this sort of demon from killing mother cow. And basically you have underneath the cow, you have Hindus sharing with the British and with Muslims just how valuable and how important protecting sort of mother cow or Mata cow is. And notably, Mahatma Gandhi sort of came up out of this time. This is when he was growing up, and he was sort of influenced very heavily by this sort of propaganda. Today, a lot of us think of him as sort of this simple man equipped with great resolve, but I think this view belies sort of his mastery of animal politics, specifically how animals can be politicized and even sort of weaponized or, created into or manufactured into sort of these political shields. And I wanted to just pull some quotes from his writings that sort of attest to this fact. Here he says, we're Hindus by virtue of how we take care of the cow who is our mother. It's one's religious duty, and one's identity is basically tied to cow protection. Notably, our oppressors slaughter her. And here he says that that foundation for that protection we see here is actually predicated on just a little bit of exploitation. So mother cow is worthy of protecting because she's able to offer us so much in terms of monetary value. So again, it wasn't just a purely uh, altruistic reason for protecting the cows from foreigners. But as we know, Gandhi was a pacifist by basically all accounts. And so while he realized that politicizing the cow was necessary to create her or transform her into a banner once again against these British invaders, he wanted to draw this fine line between sort of protecting mother cow and eschewing violence. And so he said, we can't kill one to save the other. And that really goes both ways. You don't kill a cow to save a human, but you also don't kill a human to save a cow. And as to the stance that he took on cow slaughter after the British sort of left, it was informed by his desire for India to return to, or become, I should say, a secular state for the very first time. And that required negotiating sort of the heated issue of cow slaughter between Muslims and Hindus. And so he tried to, once again, walk this fine line, arguing that cow slaughter shouldn't be stopped by law, but that cultivating kindness towards her was the only way to save her in the end. As some of you may know, ultimately Gandhi was killed by Hindu hardliners who felt he'd made too many concessions to Muslims and who wanted basically a Hindu state instead of a secular state. And the question of cow protection was certainly a part of that. And for them, for these Hindu hardliners, it was as if Gandhi, in making this concession, was promoting matricide. I'd like to come back to Gandhi a little bit later, but first I wanted to illustrate just how his and other sort of secularist views on the cow protection issue was integrated into India's constitution, because it was such a burning question at the time of the nation sort of coming into being. And so we see the question of cow slaughter, it's basically paramount to the Great Compromise in India. So what sort of the framers of their constitution determined was that there would be no national cow slaughter ban at the constitutional level. However, there would be this sort of constitutional directive to the states to prevent cow slaughter that way. And so I've offered, the language of the directive, Article 48 on the left, and on the right, we sort of see it in context. And it required, individual states to improve animal-based agriculture. The chief agriculture animal being, of course, the cow, required them to engage in animal husbandry and prohibit the slaughter of cows specifically, but also calves, and so cows and bulls in basically their first year of life, and other cattle who are able to give milk or who are able to be used for labor. And again, the thrust of this compromise was basically that Article 48, this directive to the states, was unenforceable at law. And that meant that states were expected to implement these elements, but couldn't actually be obligated legally to do so. So just a couple years after India's independence, so 1950 and 1951, you have several states start to sort of test the boundaries of what this law actually allows. Specifically, the question was, how does this constitutional protection for cows fare when considered alongside sort of the competing constitutional protected interests to the rights to engage in one's trade or one's practice and religion? And so you had 3 states in particular who've created all of these beef ban laws, and you have some 3,000 people who are butchers on the one hand and Muslims on the other, who are bringing a petition that ultimately reaches the Supreme Court. So this middle ground that the Supreme Court basically carves out, you'll see here on the left the breakdown of Article 48. And basically on the right, you have all of the determinations that the Supreme Court has made. So basically they emphasize that, yes, there is a fundamental right to religion. However, Islam doesn't actually mandate that cows be slaughtered. in the Quran, the court rules and sort of offering this exegetical reading of the text, Muslims can also sort of slaughter camels during this time. With respect to sort of the fundamental right to trade, you have here the court saying, well, we don't have to necessarily protect all of the beef industry, but we do have to protect a subsection of the beef industry. And so you don't necessarily have to kill cows in order to get beef. You can wait for them to die. You don't necessarily have to kill cows to get their leather. You can wait for them to die. And so the court, again, is driving, trying to carve out these these compromises that are going to please at least parts of both sort of camps. And there are other considerations too that the court is pointing out. Well, you know, India, in protecting these cows, or these states who are protecting these cows, are sending them to these sort of cow shelters. And basically, the court is saying in establishing basically what is happening at some of these cow shelters, they're not being provided enough food, enough water, enough space, and they compare them to these basically these concentration camps. In addition, the court is saying, well, we're a new country. We don't necessarily have enough food to feed our people. And so food security is really important. And so we can't necessarily right now take beef basically off the national menu. And again, they point to Article 48. And what they do in rendering their decision is carve out sort of some exceptions to Article 48. So, you know, certain cattle, they argue, do become useless, quote unquote, useless after a certain age. And those cattle cannot be protected unless they're cows. And cows sort of operate in this sort of significant the significant space in which they deserve or merit more protections. And again, the court's analysis isn't necessarily very sound, but again, what they're really trying to do is appease both sides and carve out this compromise for the sake of the country. And so something that's really important to note after the Supreme Court makes this decision is that the cow continues to be politicized. India is largely an illiterate country, at least in the 1940s and 1950s, and people largely vote by way of symbols. And so you have India's first prime minister, Nehru here, who didn't want cow slaughter to be an issue. And so what he wanted to do was he didn't want the state to pass a national cow slaughter law, but he was still willing to sort of milk cows for all of their political capital. And you see here his daughter, Indira Gandhi, she basically does the same, basically 20 years later. And what she does, interestingly, is she crafts this sort of campaign slogan to the tune of "Vote for calf and cow, forget all others now." And we've heard about dog whistles here in the West, but here in India, you have basically the formation of this cow whistle, and its frequency can only really be picked up by certain incorporated groups. And so she campaigns with this particular promise to encourage cow protection, but doesn't actually look to see it through out of her own sort of secularist ideals, but also not to disrespect her sort of father's stance on the issue. What she does do, however, is sort of pass this constitutional amendment, one that I mentioned earlier, that requires all citizens to demonstrate compassion for living creatures. And so we see sort of echoes here of Mohandas Gandhi's view that cow slaughter can't be stopped by law, but only by kindness. And here we sort of see that kindness integrated into sort of the foundation of the national constitution. It's a compelling, certainly, constitutional revision, but one that's sort of seen, at least at this time, to be more aspirational and one that has no real teeth. And for the purposes of my talk today, this is more or less where the question of cow protection lands in India's early years. And with that said, I'd like to go ahead now and jump sort of 50 years ahead of time to 2002 and introduce Narendra Modi, whom I mentioned earlier in my talk. He's India's current prime minister, and he's the one who's beginning to sort of craft the country's cult of cow protection vigilantism, this vigilantism that we see today. So Narendra Modi, he grew up under the youth wing of the ideological party of the RSS, and the RSS is widely held responsible for assassinating Gandhi. And he soon becomes involved with its political wing, the BJP. And his ascension is quite remarkable, if only for the violence that paved his path to power. He's a rising leader in the state of Gujarat. He becomes its governor in February of 2002. And just a couple months after he takes office, or a couple weeks actually after he takes office, a train that is bringing back Hindu pilgrims from a particular temple in a neighboring state catches fire. And the reason it catches fire is unknown, but the issue or the scenario that took place was that you basically had these Hindus in this car who were taunting a chaiwala, a Muslim chaiwala, a little boy who sells tea. And this took place at a largely Muslim station, and a fight ensued, and the train car caught fire. And apparently what Modi did is he brought the bodies back to his home country to be displayed. And this incited waves of violence across the state of Gujarat. Thousands of people died, mostly Muslims. And unfortunately, this sort of endeared him to a large percentage of his right-wing Hindu base. In fact, his own party calls for re-elections at this moment, and he wins in a landslide. He's criticized from without, but again, he's beloved by his supporters, mostly again Hindu hardliners. And because all eyes are on him at this time, he sort of shifts away slightly from trying to sort of foment this sort of communal violence. And he focuses on economics, but he also has an eye towards cow protection. And in 2005, he and his state defend a very controversial cow slaughter ban that basically prevents all cow slaughter beyond what the 1958 sort of Supreme Court allowed. And here again, I've put on the left the 1958 ruling, and to compare it to the 2005 ruling here on the right. And what the Supreme Court does is they say, well, back in 1958, we protected a large section of the beef trade, but the trade that's actually protected by the Constitution is the trade of a butcher. And so we don't necessarily have to protect butchers of beef, but we have to protect, butchers of in general, so that can apply to any other animals. And so, yes, we can ban beef slaughter in any one of these states. And some other considerations they talked about was improved food security. 50 years had gone by, and India's ability to gain protein had improved, and so it was no longer necessary, according to the court, to slaughter cows to feed a people. And they really returned to that Article 48, and I want to emphasize that Article 48 required, among other things, to improve animal agriculture and along economic lines, modern economic lines. And one of the things that the state had argued was, well, cow manure as for fuel and for fertilizer has a value beyond sort of the time limit of the cow when the cow is useful for milk or for labor. And so the cow is always sort of economically productive, whether that's, a bull or a cow or a buffalo. Those animals basically, their waste can be turned into, can be monetized and turned into gold, basically, is what the state is arguing. And the court says, well, yes, we do believe that this is part of modern animal agriculture, and this new sort of ability of the cow to generate income is beneficial for the state. So the state has an increased interest in protecting those particular animals. And what didn't exist in the prior case and exists now is Article 51 AG, the one that requires sort of states, citizens to have compassion for animals. And because a state is comprised of citizens, the state also owes a duty, according to the court, to protect for these animals. And so ultimately, what the court determines is that, yes, total cow or cattle slaughter can be prohibited at the state level. And to turn back to sort of Modi, who sort of spearheaded this victory in the courts in Gujarat, what he does is he increases maximal penalties for cow protection violations from 1 year of imprisonment to 7 years imprisonment, and from a 1,000 rupee fine to a 50,000 rupee fine. And he also resurrects the state's cow protection board, whose mission sort of calls on it to, to coordinate with groups involved in preventing sort of cow slaughter and the slaughter of cow progeny. And it's basically created to oversee an implementation of cow protection laws. And from 2011 to 2014, his government distributes several million rupees, just over 100,000 US dollars, in cash rewards to basically over 1,000 vigilantes who have raided cattle transports and who filed, first information reports against some of these alleged criminals. And he's also dedicated sort of a comparable sum to cow shelters to provide for quote unquote rescue bovines. And he's also honoring top performing, cow rikshuks or cow protection vigilantes with what he calls these best cow protector awards and the prize money. And some of you might be familiar with the political theorist Alain Badiou, and he approaches political power as, he analogizes it to performative theater. And his basic assertion is that ideology operates as a kind of ideological mask, and those in power take this ideological mask and they hold it basically as firmly as they can up to their own faces to try to make themselves appear to the masses that they themselves are a manifestation or an embodiment of that ideology. And here we have a Hindu or Hindutva-centered cow protection, and we have Modi claiming to be one with or a manifestation of that ideology. And of course, as the man who hands out these best cow protector awards, Modi himself becomes the best cow protector. He owns that mask that he himself hands out. And the question is, well, what does this look like? And I sort of scoured the internet, and I think it looks something very much like this. You see here Modi handing out basically carbon copies of his own persona, and he encourages his followers to sort of adopt that as their own face. And it starts at an early age. So, we have these ideological state apparatuses that include, religious institutions, but also educational schools as well. And you see children at a very young age sort of taking part in this indoctrination. To jump ahead to 2014, we have Narendra Modi, who is running for office on the national stage, and he's running for the prime ministership of India. And what he makes as part of his larger campaign promise is a promise to combat what he calls this national pink scare. And what he says of the opposing party is that the Congress party, the opposing party, are exporting beef in order to bring about a revolution. And because of this, he says, our animal wealth is being slaughtered, our cows are being slaughtered, are being sent abroad to be slaughtered. And now he says what the Congress, the opposing party, is saying is that if you vote for us, we're going to give you permission to kill cows. And what we see here is that he's enlisting the cow as sort of this political logo, not too different from previous political parties. And he vows to, at this moment, institute a national ban on cow slaughter. And what we see sort of under his reign are these lynchings that rise to such a level that journalists today now compare them to some of the dreaded bus plunge stories that blanket this particular region. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, it's basically where dozens of passengers plummet from cliff sides down to their deaths in some of these mountainous regions. And the tragedy of this comparison, of course, is that these stories have grown so commonplace, these cow vigilante violence stories have grown so commonplace, so ordinary, that only the most heinous accounts now are deemed sort of newsworthy today. And against this backdrop, we see a rise in cow protection laws, with politicians realizing that the only way that they can rise to power or stay in power is to increase the penalties for cow slaughter in their own jurisdictions. And what I've sort of crafted here for you is just a sampling of some of these modified beef ban laws in some of these states. And so in Madhya Pradesh, we have this 7 maximum year sentence for the slaughter or illegal transport of cows and their progeny, and the state, the chief minister of the state boasts that it's the strongest in the country, but that doesn't last long, because what we see here is a little bit of one-upsmanship. So you have in Gujarat, they before had a 1-year maximum sentence with that 1,000 rupee fine, but they've tripled it, or or sorry, they've multiplied it by 7 with respect to the sentence, a 7-year sentence, and then a 50,000 rupee fine, or both. And that doesn't last very long, because then you have Maharashtra in 2015, and they create the very first ban on actual beef consumption. And what they institute is a 5-year maximum sentence and a 1,000 rupee fine. And notably, upon its passage, the chief minister of the state wrote that our dream of a ban on cow slaughter becomes a reality now. And then you have Haryana in 2015, just a few months later. Before, they had a 5-year maximum sentence, and they've doubled it to a 10-year maximum sentence, up to a 100,000 rupee fine. And notably, the burden of proof is shifted to the defendants to prove that they are actually innocent. And so you have some very concerning justice justice issues, criminal justice issues at play here. And then, of course, we get to Gujarat in 2017. So it's just before elections, and they return to their sort of previous beef ban law and, quote unquote, beef it up just before the elections are to take place. And so what they do is that they create a 7 to 10 year maximum sentence for illegally transporting cows and transporting cows after dark. Cow slaughter is punishable by life now, or 100,000 to a 500,000 rupee fine, or both, which, if you're in this trade, is an unfathomable amount of money to comprehend. And the fine also is not bailable. And the chief minister, upon its passage, boasted it is now the strongest in the nation. Sort of echoing this sentiment, we have Gujarat's prime minister, who's praising the law and the BJP, the national BJP party, for providing for its passage. And what he argues is that now we've equaled the killing of a cow or a cow progeny with the killing of a human being. And this is basically where our sort of one-upsmanship game has taken us to. Basically a campaign to outdo all of the others, to assume, to go back to our previous metaphor, to assume the mantle of the Best Cow Protector Award. Indeed, you know, just some days later after this bill is passed, you have Chhattisgarh's BJP governor, who's approached after this Gujarat Amendment by reporters, and they want to know what measures he's taking to strengthen cow protection laws in his state. To say the least, he is also a BJP official, and he's exasperated. And what he counters with is a question of his own. And he says, you know, is cow slaughter happening anywhere in the state? Have any cows been killed in our state in the past 15 years? And finally, he says with sort of a smile, well, we'll hang anyone who slaughters a cow. And it's easy to dismiss this as a joke in poor taste, but what I think the BJP governor's response attests to here is the uncanny power of humor to deny in the same breath the very thing that it acknowledges in the other, and that's that this beef ban sort of regime under Narendra Modi, at least, if not further back, has legitimized murder. And so these laws truly do go hand in hand and engender some of the cow vigilante violence that are carried out under their name or under their banner. As I mentioned, there have been dozens of killings and hundreds of serious injuries, even sexual assaults carried out in the name of cow protection in India today. Only twice has Modi spoken out against the violence of his own sort of manufacture. The first time he sort of disclaimed all responsibility, arguing that these aggressors were merely masquerading as cow protectors. And in doing so, he's sort of attempting to reject the framework that he himself has constructed and the mask that he has sort of doled out to fashion these people in his own image. Interestingly, the backlash that he receives from his own right-wing followers was relatively swift, and they argued that he had turned his back on them. So he sort of made a conscious decision never to sort of upset his base with respect to cow protection in the country. If we can just go back to our theme just a second, and sort of arguing against his base, this comment that he made with respect to these aggressors only masquerading as cow protectors, that blowback that he got is almost as if there had been a slip of the mask. And again, he was said to have turned his back on cows. And the question sort of that people were asking was, well, how can he be the one handing out these Best Cow Protector Awards? They're essentially modeled after himself. And so we see even Narendra Modi sort of trapped in this beef ban violence of his own creation. And the violence rises to such a fever pitch in 2017 that the Supreme Court finally determines that it has to act. You have sort of complicit police and you have complicit judges who are not only sort of turning a blind eye, but sometimes aiding these cow vigilantes. And basically what the court does here is they catalog the rise in cow protection vigilantism, and they create a very clear framework for how state governments are to sort of check mob-related violence. And you'll see here on the slide that the petitioners also asked the Supreme Court to overturn its own 2005 ruling that essentially paved the way for some of these cow protection laws. Their argument being that these laws ostensibly passed to protect the voiceless were actually allowing majoritarian or Hindu interests to co-opt them and weaponize these laws to attack minoritized groups. The court, however, did not act upon that prayer. Today, states have generally set up the frameworks demanded by the Supreme Court, but aren't actually seeing the provisions carried out. Indeed, cow vigilantism is still going on in India today. What I'd like to do now is to conclude by returning our attention to some of these voiceless animals, these quote unquote animals of plenty, who, as it turns out, are still being milked for all their worth in new and sometimes disturbing ways. With so many cows being kept alive, India is actually struggling to find ways to sustain economically that protection that they want to afford these animals. More than just using them for their labor and for their milk and for fertilizer and fuel, the Indian economy is now sort of forced to develop new ways of commodifying the cow. And so you see the creation of cow dung and soaps and toothpaste and naturopathic oils such as henna and medicines such for arthritis. And most recently, even as a cure, it was marketed cow urine as a cure for the coronavirus. And so what we see with this cow of plenty, to return again to our metaphor, it's a political theater that's struggling to sustain itself. And given the great harm that the animal agriculture industry has on the environment and vital resources like water in such a drought vulnerable country, we know that it simply can't go on, though our political actors are still trying. And this, according to the theorist Alain Badiou, is sort of the natural end of such ideological plays. They can only go on. He says they end only when they can no longer go on. And I think, again, the metaphor that Badiou employs is apt here. And what he does is he offers us this lesson that the old ideology sort of decomposes and becomes a source of nourishment for a future ideology to take root. And again, what he argues is that it's only a matter of time. And we see this with the number of cows and buffaloes and bulls who are dying in some of these cow shelters. And even though the political theater is doing its best to sort of economize the current situation, it's unfortunately unsustainable. And so what does this mean for animal advocates, and sort of what lessons can we take away? And again, I'd like to return to the inspiration for my talk. I think it's important to note that although the statement is widely attributed to Gandhi, Gandhi never said it. At least there's no evidence and no citation to back it up. And given Gandhi's own inclination to lend his voice to the voiceless while still commodifying them, perhaps I think it's best that animal advocates take this as an opportunity to reclaim, to reconfigure, and to make this particular statement our own again. Without a doubt, what we're witnessing is a new era, one in which the moral progress of nations is being evaluated increasingly, I think, based on how their animals are treated. And it's my hope that we're doing so, that in doing so, we as animal advocates are not only being cognizant of the frameworks we're employing to sort of evaluate the treatment of animals, protecting them from their most vocal protectors as well, but also that we're expanding sort of the scope of our own compassion to include all animals in the assessment of the nation, both human and non. Thank you very much.